the stormwater program at this point. And I've been involved in implementing new development requirements throughout California and the Bay Area for a couple of decades now. And I'm very pleased to be here today and to be able to work with all of you on the subject of reviewing stormwater control plans. I'm here with Rob Carson and Howard Bunce from the Marin County Stormwater Pollution Prevention Program. They'll be assisting with some of the logistics, and also Sandy Matthews from Larry Walker and Associates here working with the Napa Countywide Stormwater Pollution Prevention Program. All folks who are likely to be familiar to many of you. So this is a two-part training. We're starting today with collecting municipal staff from throughout the 4 North Bay counties together. And I hope we can have a good interactive session talking about the basics and some of the details of reviewing stormwater control plans. Sometime at some date yet to be completely nailed down, but likely in June, will be a second part, which will involve both folks working for municipalities and land development professionals who prepare the submittals that you review. And that larger group or more diverse or broader group will be talking about planning, design, construction, and maintenance of low impact development features and facilities. We have a poll to start off just to make sure everybody's awake, and so we can get some information from you. We'll take a few minutes for folks to answer these questions. We see the answers accumulating rapidly.
And maybe give it another minute. We're at about 68% in so far, so climbing fast.
Okay.
That may be all we're getting. Dan, you want me to end the poll?
Sure.
Okay.
We get a display of results, or how does it work?
Yeah, I think it should publish the results so folks can kind of see what a couple more are trickling in here. Great, and some people are entering their comments for the future discussion into the chat as the quiz asked them to do, so good. All right, I'm gonna go ahead and end the poll.
Great.
and share the results so folks can see. Can everybody see those results?
Yes.
Great. Yeah, it looks like we're somewhat evenly split between folks who have broad responsibilities with regard to implementing the NPDS program versus those who are mostly focused on provision E12. I think that probably, my guess is, reflects partly the size of the agency that they're working for. And also seeing that reviewing stormwater control plans is definitely the focus of most of the people who are here. And for those who it is a minor part of what they do, we'll of course make sure that we cover the basics as well as the details. Okay, so let's move on to some logistics. So we're going to try to make this as interactive as possible, but we have somewhere north of 95 people, I think, who registered for this, and probably by this time 70 or 80 who are here with us at the moment. And so in order to handle the traffic, please mute yourself when not speaking and use the raise hand function on your screen when you want to speak. And there will be a little bit of confusion around that, and we'll figure it out, but we'll make sure that if you raise your hands, we get to you and do our best to have the interaction and answer the question. Or you can use the chat. And Rob and Howard are helping to monitor that, so we make sure we don't lose any of those if they're answered timely. You can also use the reactions on there to indicate agreement or applause or whatever you'd like. We're taking a break at 2:20 for 10 minutes. After that, we have a couple more items. One is the compliance for small projects, presentation and discussion. And then comes what I hope will be the most interactive part of the afternoon, which is a discussion of frequently encountered issues. Certainly, no one person can even know very much of all the things that comes up. And one of the real benefits, I think, of getting everyone together, even as we are online today, is to have the opportunity to have some back and forth and share experiences. And so I'm hoping that we can not only have a Q&A there, but actually some back and forth and interaction in sharing experiences, reviewing stormwater control plans.
For those of you not fully up to speed on Zoom and where the buttons are at, if you click the reactions tab at the bottom, that's where you'll find the button to raise hand. And we are now up to 89 participants, Dan.
Wow. Welcome, everyone. Okay. And let's take a few minutes, even as we are here right now, for folks to identify any particular expectations. If you came today with saying, boy, I sure hope he talks about this, or I really, this particular issue is on my mind, we'll take a few minutes. We'll take some of those thoughts now as well as what we're getting out of the chat. So.
Not seeing any raised hands yet. If anybody has anything to contribute now, go ahead and raise your hand, or if you're too shy, go ahead and type it in the chat. We can handle it either way.
All right, looks like we got a couple of good questions already in the chat. And feel free to plug those in at any time.
Will, I briefly saw your hand up. Did you have a question?
No, I didn't have a question.
Okay.
Thanks. Not yet, anyway.
All right, so Sandy asked in the chat, how do we deal with projects that deviate from the submitted stormwater control plans? E.g., they planted roses instead of bioretention planned species. So,
Okay, well, it's a good topic, and we'll be sure to get to the significance of what plants are picked and why.
And Sonia asked she's hoping that you'll cover road rehab projects and the changing perspective on their requirements.
Yeah. Okay, very good. Make sure we cover those after the break. All right, so for our agenda today, we're going to talk a little bit about objectives and make sure we're on board for what we want to accomplish today. We've got 10 minutes or so on the overview of what's in the post-construction manual and the resources, particularly if this is a new topic for you. The idea here is that, well, the post-construction manual, once you open it, and start to go over it, should be pretty explanatory, but we want to go over what's there and make sure you know what's there. And if you're starting out in this field, that you know the resources that are available to you. Following that, we'll have a presentation and maybe some back and forth on what to look for first. And this is just based largely on my own experience as a stormwater control plan reviewer. Working both in the phase 2 and in the phase 1 municipalities, largely in the Bay Area. And often it's, as soon as you crack the cover, you kind of have a feeling about how it's going to go. And so usually I try to go for a fast fail if there's going to be a problem with it. So we'll just review what to look for first. And what could cause you to kind of close the cover again and send it back. Then we'll go over a step-by-step review, sort of the way of cranking through a review of a stormwater control plan, maybe some tips, and I hope we can do some sharing there as well. And then cover some key parts of bioretention maintenance, particularly the maintenance requirements or level of detail that is appropriate for a stormwater control plan. We'll have that break at around 2:20. Then we'll have a session on compliance for small projects. I know for a lot of municipalities, probably for a lot of you, most of what you get into review are applications for small projects. And in that, we'll be focusing on this difficult issue of how much do you really ask for and can expect to get. And then we'll have that discussion and back and forth on frequently encountered issues. So the objectives for today's session, basically know what to expect to get in a stormwater control plan. That's and focused on kind of what are the basic things that you need in order to be able to say, yes, this applicant demonstrated that they'll be in compliance with the requirements in provision E12. We'll review some of the common errors and shortcomings, things that we typically see that don't come up to snuff in stormwater control plans, and discuss a little bit about how some tips for articulating comments in such a way to ensure that they're addressed in subsequent revisions. So with that, let's get into the manual and resources. And again, any questions that come up, just go ahead and pop that hand up. Someone will alert me that there's a hand, and we'll glad to interrupt myself and answer questions as we go along. So the post-construction manual used in all of the 4 North Bay counties. It was originally produced in 2014. A grant was obtained from the North Bay Watershed Association for the Bay Area Stormwater Management Agencies Association. And the original version of the manual was produced to cover provision E12 implementation, the phase 2 permit, which is in effect in the North Bay counties. And it's pretty similar in most aspects with some occasional significant differences to provision C3 in the municipal regional stormwater permit for the phase 1 counties, which covers Contra Costa, Alameda, Santa Clara, and San Mateo counties. The chapters that are in the manual pretty much cover what's in the requirements. The manual is oriented toward an audience meant to be read by the folks who are responsible for preparing submittals. And so, it's meant to be in a kind of accessible way addressed to them. And so chapter 2 provides basically a discussion of here's how you get to where you want to go in terms of complying. Chapter 3 is the step-by-step process of preparing a stormwater control plan. Chapter 4 gets into the more technical aspects of how do you show what your LID design is all about. And then chapter 5 is an operation and maintenance plan directions. So we'll go over each of those. Chapter 1, the key part of it here, the thing to know, there's really 2 tiers of requirements for smaller projects. The requirement is to implement runoff reduction measures. And basically, the 2 key ways of doing that are to disperse runoff to landscape. By far the most cost-effective and usually easiest to implement way of doing that. And the sort of secondary way, which sometimes works fitting it into a project site design, is to use some amount of pervious pavement for a walkway or a patio or a plaza. And the method of getting to compliance on that is simply to follow the instructions in the template, which is in Appendix C of the post-construction manual. The plan for a single-family home or small development project. Larger projects, the second tier, those that are not single-family homes and that create or replace 5,000 square feet or more of impervious surface. Those basically, the difference there is that after implementing runoff reduction measures, any remaining runoff from impervious surfaces needs to be routed to a treatment facility, which is basically just about always a bioretention facility. So that's sort of the key design and construction requirement. There are also the requirements to identify specific pollutant sources and corresponding source control measures, and to describe how maintenance is going to be provided for bioretention facilities. And the method of getting to compliance there is to submit a stormwater control plan for a regulated project in Appendix D of the manual. Going through this to chapter 4, documenting your LID design. I just wanted to point out that there the key aspect is making sure that the bioretention facilities are sized correctly, and not just sized correctly, but that there is obviously enough preparation for planning to build these facilities the way that they need to be built so they will function properly. The key aspect there is to make the top of soil surface of the facility flat. This figure in the manual has the basic details and the specifications that are required for that. It's intended to provide just enough information without being too restrictive or too prescriptive to ensure that these facilities function correctly. But at the stormwater control plan stage, particularly when you're first looking at that layout, the question is has the applicant thought through to make sure that they've set aside the areas that are necessary to build these facilities and that they can build them flat. In addition to the post-construction manual, there's a checklist that can basically be used to screen a proposed development site for potential sources of pollutants based on the future uses of the site. There's the checklist for that along, and for each source, there are the source control measures that should be included in the stormwater control plan. There's a construction checklist to be followed during the process of building bioretention facilities. As noted before, there's the template for small projects. There's a template for larger regulated projects. There's a plant matrix, and we already have a question about plants, so we'll be touching on that. And then in addition to the appendices, there are some resources that are downloadable from both the NAPA program website and the Marin program website to help use the manual. There's an Excel-based calculator. I actually don't know how much that's used, but it's pretty handy. There's a couple of example stormwater control plans that are intended to provide the level of detail and provide additional insight into how to put together a stormwater control plan. For the same hypothetical projects, there are example operation and maintenance plans. There are templates for the operation and maintenance agreement. There's some details on technical criteria for the use of non-LID facilities for the very rare projects where those are appropriate and allowed. And there's an inspection checklist for bioretention facilities. Do we have any questions yet? Okay.
I'm not seeing any questions yet. We're getting some feedback on topics to cover in the later discussion.
Great. I'm seeing number 7 on the chat, so I look forward to seeing what's there.
And there was one question earlier that might be relevant to this content is there a checklist for the most critical items to cover during the review process?
Well, there is a checklist in the manual itself, and right, that is, bring that up.
It's Appendix B is the construction inspection checklist.
Right, but is there also a checklist for, I think there's a checklist for what's in the plan as well? Is that?
Yeah, I
Appendix
think
A is the source and source control checklist. If that's what you're referring to.
Second here. I have, let's see here. Here, yes, this checklist. That's what I was referring to. Everyone see this? So this is on page 3-2 of the manual. And so these are meant to assist the reviewer in being able to identify, whether each of these items has been incorporated. And what we'll get to in the next presentation is sort of some kind of order of this, is which things to look for first. I hope that answered the question. Is there a follow-up, or?
if not, hopefully that individual will speak up and follow up on that question.
Good. All right. So I wanted to talk a little bit about this because, frankly, and maybe we can even get into some back and forth on this, because this is kind of like the toughest aspect that comes, I think, to being a reviewer working for an agency, is what can you ask for? How hard do you push? What topics do you push on? What is the scope of your authority? And of course, that all depends. It varies from municipality to municipality. It kind of depends on the specific political and bureaucratic situation that you're in. But I just wanted to emphasize here that, of course, the first thing that you're being asked to do, sort of the definition of the job, is to ensure that when your agency gives approval of this application for a development, and the development is allowed to go ahead, and along with being in compliance with zoning codes, various other requirements, that it's in compliance with its NPDES permit, with your NPDES permit. And so by taking the action of approving the project, that action is then in compliance with what's required in E12. But there's a lot more to that. And of course, it's completely possible and happens often enough to have approval of a project and the bioretention facilities are ugly, unmaintainable, not in the right place, conflict with other uses, are built in a way that they block access to something. So there's obviously a lot more that goes in saying, oh yeah, this complied with the minimum requirements of E12C or whatever it is. We also want to be able to say that it benefits the project, that it benefits the community. And I think just sort of in terms of mindset is being able to start from a point that, yeah, we want to accomplish both. We want to ensure the project maximizes the community benefit, and that these facilities are built in such a way that they're going to be taken care of. One of the whole principles of LID, once had a conversation some years ago with Larry Kaufman, who was the sort of a visionary manager at Prince George's County, Maryland, who coined the term low impact development and got an EPA grant and got his ideas into a manual that sort of started the whole thing. And he let me in on the point that the way it really got started was that the stormwater treatment facilities that they were building were not very attractive. They tended to be the old-fashioned extended detention basins. They were usually behind a fence. They were usually in the back of the development. and that they didn't get taken care of, and that they turned into nuisances. And the whole idea of LID was not just kind of that it was beautiful, although LID often is, or that it was more effective by trying to mimic the hydrology of the site rather than, sort of gather all the runoff and take it off somewhere and treat it. But the strongest driver was to make sure that there was interaction between the people who lived and used the development site and the stormwater facilities in such a way that they'd be conscious of them, that they'd expect them to be maintained, that they'd notice whether they were attractive or not. And so part of the whole idea here of LID and what we're doing with this provision and this requirement is to ensure that not only that we build facilities that function in such a way that they treat stormwater, but also that they benefit the project and that they have value in the eyes of the people who are using the site. And so we want to make sure I have up here the words robust, that they're resilient, and maintenance is you can get there to maintain it, and that it's doesn't cost very much to do it, all of which are characteristics of LID facilities, and we'll get into a little more detail there as we go along. And then I think, to kind of take this stance that we're not trying to use NPDES to control land use. Our idea is that if a project's going to be built and it's going to be built in compliance with the NPDES permit, that we're going to try to, first of all, get it through the process as efficiently and at a reasonable cost as we can. And that at the same time, we want good design, because we want the facility to serve the community. In trying to do this as reviewers, we have the authority of the permit. We have the authority of the Clean Water Act and the California Water Code. Many local ordinances reference the Phase 2 permit. I think a lot of them also specify particularly the post-construction requirements and say that any application for approval needs to be in compliance. Then there's just general municipal authority over development and land use. So as a reviewer, I think all of us who are involved in this, again, subject to how much support we have within our organizations, both politically and bureaucratically, we have the ability to influence how projects are built and to hold the line on saying no, you can't do the minimum and build something that's not a benefit, but there's a broad overarching authority to require good design, basically. Comments on that or questions? Anybody want to pitch in on that? All right. Again, I may come back to this more as we go on. All right. So here's the section on what to look for first. And here's what I do when I open a stormwater control plan. I turn to the exhibit. So maybe on the way I notice whether they use the template, whether it really looks like what I'm expecting for a stormwater control plan. But the first thing I want to look at is their diagram in the back. And I'm showing here the exhibit that goes with the example residential stormwater control plan downloadable from the website. One thing I want to notice there, note there is that this plan has I think 45 drainage management areas in it, and yet it still fits with all the information in a simple sketch on an 8.5 by 11. So a lot of the time I'll get some feedback from an applicant's engineer that, you know, it was just too complicated to break up the site into all those different drainage management areas. And yeah, maybe or maybe not. Maybe it's like actually pretty straightforward to do it if you organize your work well and are willing to spend a few hours doing it. I think entering this into the calculator as an example, you know, was something to yeah, you know, it wasn't zero time, but it was doable within about 45 minutes. So the objective here is to ensure that all the runoff is treated. And the sort of key to that is ensuring that all of the site, the entire parcel, the entire project area is divided into discrete drainage management areas. And so that is a necessary prerequisite to ensure that the sizing requirements for the facilities that those DMAs drain to is met. So what I'm looking for when I open this up and I look at the exhibit is I want to see that the drainage management areas are clearly delineated, that each is labeled with a unique identifier so I can follow it through the calculations and the narrative, that the square footage is on there, labeled again, so I can follow along with the identifier that, you know, we have, say, you know, number 3 RF here, and I can see 1,846 square feet, and that is reflected in the calculations and in the summary and the explanation of what's going on. And that I can tell, not necessarily by a word, but I can tell by looking at the layout what type of surfaces it is, whether it's roof, pavement, or landscaping. Similarly, with the bioretention facilities, I want to be able to look at this and see where they are and see that each bioretention facility is labeled with a unique identifier. So I say all this and then I say, you know, it happens, not infrequently. I hope less frequently than it used to. We were first starting out with this, that you open up one of these and the applicant hasn't done this. They've confused the idea of a stormwater control plan with some kind of other hydrology report, or they've said, well, you know, I've been working in Southern California for a long time. I'm going to give them a report the same way that I always do it in Southern California and turn it in and see what changes they need in order to accept it. And you know, at that point, I already know that I got a problem, because this is sort of the bottom line of where to start with this. And if I don't get almost all of what is shown here in terms of, well, certainly if I don't have a division in the drainage management areas, but if I don't also have most of what's shown here in terms of properly labeled, I will tend to try to save everybody time and, you know, my reviewer's fee. You know, a lot of the time I won't even write a letter necessarily. I'll send an email and say, you know, that they need to have another go with this, and if they need, you know, direction or, you know, something to be kind of pointed in which way they want to go on this, you know, we should have a conversation about it. But so, you know, usually this is like the first 10 minutes, first 15 minutes of my review, I can check in on this. Another thing I look for is there a fatal flaw? And this is really kind of the summary of what I'll see most commonly, where say, you know, what they've come up here with is not going to work, and it's going to require extensive revisions, even to their concept of what they want to do. And beginning with that is that they're not treating all the areas on the site. They've decided to do some LID, some treatment, but they haven't covered the entire site. And a real tip off to that, just something to watch for, is if you look at a grading and drainage plan and it shows storm drain inlets, it's kind of a tip off that, you know, hey, where are those going? Are they going to treatment? Maybe on a steeper hillside site, they have kind of some kind of scheme where they're capturing drainage from roofs and pavement up further up the slope, piping it down to the bottom of the slope where there's bioretention facilities. But that's pretty rare. Usually if you see a storm drain inlet, you know, it's a problem. That's some area that they're indicating that they don't have a plan to treat. If there's an inlet, it should really be an overflow, and it should be in a bioretention facility, or maybe an area drain in a dispersal area. A second fatal error, pretty common even now, is for one reason or another, the applicant will believe that they can use non-LID treatment. And so they'll have some reason that they think that applies. It usually doesn't. Obviously, there is non-LID treatment is covered, allowed. There's an allowance for it in E12, but it's for very, very narrow circumstances. And you see people try to use it in everything from parking lots and storage facilities and, you know, everything else. And so if you see that again, that's you know, kind of a point that it's like, okay, maybe you don't want to take too long to go over point by point on your review, and you just want to get right in and deal with that problem. So they're trying to use non-LID when LID is required. A third problem that I often see, and this is the applicant's engineer thinks they have a great idea. Under different circumstances, it might even be a great idea. But what you want to watch out for is the situation where either to get below a threshold or to avoid using a lot of treatment, they're installing a substantial amount of pervious pavement. And the real question on that is, do they know what they're doing in terms of the engineering of pervious pavement and of the limitations of pervious pavement? And that typically comes down to two things. One is that they're trying to install it on a slope when in the criteria that are in the manual for very good reasons. I think we say 2% in there. Even that is kind of pushing it. Is that installing it on a slope is going to be a real problem unless you have a lot of excavation and a lot of preparation. You know, we'll get to in the second part of this training on designing pervious pavement, but it's pretty involved and a lot more involved than typically an engineer will have thought of when they propose this. And then the other is someone's proposed to do even a flat parking lot, and they're going to do it on clay soils, and they haven't thought through or don't know that involves substantial vehicle loads. Vehicle loads on pervious pavement require a deep base course, a thick section. And that requires a lot of material to be brought in and a lot of material to be excavated and brought out. And they haven't thought through the costs of that. And so they are proposing something, and you have something in front of you that they're not really that prepared to build. And then the last item on this of like fatal errors, and this is actually what happened in this particular one here, is the applicant had come in, they weren't using these landscaped areas for bioretention. That's the first thing that I noticed. So, well, what are they doing? Well, this site has a mild slope going this way towards this drainage channel. And their thought was just they take everything and they just kind of drain it over this way. They put a bioretention basin here, and then it would go from the bioretention basin into the drainage channel. And the question for them there is well, how are you going to get the under drains from that bioretention facility into that drainage channel? And of course, that would require a new outfall to the drainage channel, which for a couple of reasons, including the ownership of that drainage channel and the issue that a new outfall might well require either a 401 permit or a fish and game permit or both. That was not going to happen. And so this was basically a fatal error. The whole idea that they had here wasn't going to work on. And they needed to redo this and figure out how to move the runoff after it was treated out to existing storm drains that were out on this side of the property. So that's a typical shortcoming that will kind of cause me to abort further review after seeing that and focus on helping them solve that problem before I review all the detail in the plan. This is another example that comes up again way too often. I think what happened here is that this was a case where someone had a subdivision map that they'd gotten approved a long time ago and were coming back to try to build this subdivision, and of course don't want to move the lines around or create anything new. But for various reasons, they were subject to C3 and couldn't be grandfathered for that. So they did have to do the new development requirements. And so their answer was to take a corner of the lot, which was originally intended for a flood detention basin, and combine it and put a bioretention basin and a flood detention basin in the same little area. And just eyeballing this, if you've been doing review of stormwater control plan exhibits for a while, you can kind of glance and say, that's too small for that whole site. That's not going to work. So that was part of the problem. And then the other problem is just basically the only way to do this was to have piped drainage, as you can see, that would drain both the streets and the lots and discharge that into this flood detention basin. And then their idea was to simply put the bioretention basin at the bottom of the facility. And that just is not going to work from an operational point of view. Again, this is one of those cases where I was like, yeah, you may have, at least come close or have some kind of argument for why this would be in compliance with the MPDS requirements, but it's not something that we're going to allow you to build because you can't get down there and to maintain it. It's ugly. It's you're going to have to fence it. It's creates a safety hazard, and this is just not a workable plan. We're going to have to back off and figure out how to work with the engineering before we can complete the stormwater control plan. The next thing that I would look at, sort of screening a stormwater control plan for fatal flaws, is making sure that, assuming that we do have the drainage management areas shown correctly on the exhibit, bioretention facilities are shown on the exhibit, that they've tabulated the drainage management areas, shown the facilities, that the one represented what's shown on the exhibit in the calculation, and that the calculations, at least without going through and doing them over again, that they're laid out in a way that makes sense. So that's it. Any questions on that section on what to look for first? Anyone want to share what they look for first?
Dan, I always check to make sure they're referencing the right permit.
Yeah, right. Yeah. Yeah, they at least know what their requirements are.
Dan, we had a question earlier that said, what can be added to the plans to ensure the drainage area is actually drained at the facility, especially with pavement? Is there something you look for as an easy way to see on the plan how that's delineated?
I would say that that is a common problem. I think I know what the questioner is getting at, is that you see the drainage management area, you see the bioretention facility. How is the runoff getting from point A to point B? And if it's not obvious, I will certainly ask. I think as you get into the more detailed step-by-step review, I would be looking for an explanation of that if it is not clear. The concern about it is that if there isn't any obvious way, for instance, that water is being moved from a roof across a parking lot to a facility on the other side of the parking lot. The concern is that they are putting that in a pipe to go underneath that parking lot and then discharging it into a facility that's on the other side. And then you have the depth of the pipe and you have the slope of the pipe going across the length of that parking lot, dropping as it goes, and that you will end up with a facility top of soil elevation at some depth below where the parking lot is, and that is going to cause all kinds of problems because one thing we don't want to see is our bioretention facilities down in pits, and so at that I look for in doing the more detailed step-by-step reviews we're getting into is I look for at least some written explanation, if not a drawing, showing me, oh no, we're gonna put that either we're gonna use sheet flow, we're gonna use a surface swale, or even a trench drain type arrangement to move the runoff across. Other questions?
Not seeing other hands up, but feel free to type stuff into the chat and I'll let Dan know that's there.
Yeah, and when you type things into the chat, make sure it goes out to everyone so that we can all see the questions.
All right, so reviewing step by step, here's my process. Is the first thing I look for is, did they use the template? If they use the template, you sort of like got a leg up right away. At least it prompted them to put all of the things in there that need to be in there. Do they have all the pieces? Do they have a narrative? Do they have an exhibit? Does it look like they followed what the manual is there? Are there and then besides having just the sketch or the minimum level of detail of showing the drainage management areas and the bioretention facilities, did they include other drawings, which is always helpful. And I think one trend that I've seen, certainly in the time that I have been doing this and since we started doing this, I think in general, in a lot of areas, municipalities are asking for more in terms of what the level of engineering detail that is being done before a project goes through design review and before it goes to a planning commission, depending on how it's done. But a lot of the time, there are drawings out there. Whether they're included or not, sometimes if they're not included, I'll even ask for them. Sometimes they're volunteered, but it's really great to have a grading and drainage plan, to have some civil sheets with details showing cross sections of bioretention facilities, to have a landscape plan showing a planting plan, and some renderings that give you an idea of how this is supposed to look on the site, which often gives you some key as to how they're handling the depth and the visual of the bioretention facilities. And then finally, the last thing, just kind of pulling the thing out and looking at it for the first time, you do get, I see a lot of stormwater control plans that for some reason they're sort of trying to combine it with a whole hydrology report, which, it's not necessarily fatal that you've got, information that you don't need and that doesn't really apply, but often they get sort of muddied together, and the applicant's engineer is trying to solve the problem of showing that the peak runoff from the site will not damage downstream facilities. At the same time, they're trying to show NPDES compliance and kind of turn it into a model. So that's the first things that I look for. By this time, I will have looked at the exhibit with the drainage management areas and the bioretention facilities, the calculations. Next is the project data form. One thing to look at right away is there congruence between what's shown on the exhibit and what's shown on the project data form in terms of the new and replaced impervious area? And particularly if you have a project where a portion or all of the site is being redeveloped and you're trying to figure out whether the 50% rule applies, then you need to make sure that what is put in these boxes here for the new and replaced impervious area, the pre-project and the post-project, is accurate. And this is a case where I often find that if a project has been revised, it's gone through a couple of iterations before you see it, before they turn over the stormwater control plan, often there'll be some old version of the numbers in here, and it'll be misleading, and you'll need to send a note back and get that straightened out.
Hey, Dan, can you clarify the 50% rule for the folks that may be sitting through this kind of training for the first time?
Yeah, and let me tell you, if you're in the South Bay counties and under provision C3 of the municipal regional stormwater permit, it has one definition of the 50% rule. And if you're in the North Bay counties under phase 2, you have a very different version of the 50% rule. They mean different things and affect projects quite differently. The version that we have in the North Bay, basically the comparison is, are you increasing the total amount of impervious area on the site by, let's see, when you finish your project, will you have doubled the amount of impervious area on the site? And if that is true, then you have to do the whole site. You have to retrofit the portion of the site that was not previously built. In the South Bay, it's how much impervious area that's already built are you affecting, which is a different question. Obviously, if I have a project and half of it is built and half of it is unbuilt, and you were building on the unbuilt portion, you might trigger the 50% rule in the North Bay counties, but the same project would not trigger the 50% rule in the South Bay counties. So was that clear? I hope I didn't provide so much there to make it confusing, but basically if you are creating or replacing an amount of impervious area greater than equal to what is already there, then the 50% rule applies. And the way that you can tell that is by looking at these numbers here.
And then Dan, just to follow up on that, that means that, so if I've exceeded the 50% rule, that means I need to treat the total runoff from all of the from the entire project.
Right,
and if I'm lower than the 50% rule, my bioretention only has to be designed for the new portion that I'm building.
Thank you, Sandy. Thank you for that clarification. Any questions on the 50% rule? We can bring it up later if folks want to. Next thing I'll look at is whether the narrative that's in there, and sometimes engineers don't like to write down stuff. They don't like to tell stories, and So often this will be either minimal or left out. The template provides a prompt, and the manual states that you should provide a narrative and explain basically for each drainage management area and each bioretention facility how the drainage is going. And that can be kind of repetitive, but let me tell you, when you get into that question, is someone was asking, how do you know that the runoff is getting from point A to point B? The narrative is often the way that you know that, and having it really kind of pulls the whole thing together. And then often if someone has submitted additional drawings, it's a really good idea to check and make sure that the grading and drainage plan and the stormwater control plan line up and are showing the same thing. I read through the whole thing beginning to end after I've done that first check. I mark it up as I go along, because if I don't do that, I forget stuff. Often at this point, you can see if there's something going on in the explanation of what the project is, that often that same effect of if there's been iterations of the project, if the stormwater control plan was prepared earlier and then the project something changed, you'll get contradictory claims or compliance strategies. You'll get something suggested in one place. And often that's something you can just straighten out by asking a few questions, but you certainly don't want to let the stormwater control plan go through having stuff that's not internally congruent. Often there's misunderstandings, which that's another reason for requiring a narrative, and another reason for reviewing it carefully is that you can tell that the applicant's engineer, just there's something they didn't get, and this is the opportunity to tell that and follow up on it. Including highlighting, following through, making notes, and checking up on making sure that they follow through on their source control measures and their O&M. So when I write a review letter, if I get to the point of writing a review letter, and I was saying sometimes you sort of stop the process early because it's not going where it needs to go yet. I try to number the comments and keep issues distinct, and that just really helps in the organize the process of making sure that each issue has been responded to. I really like it when I can reference the specific place in the manual and or in the permit. And this sort of takes it away from saying, this is my opinion, this is what we like to see. Anything that has to do with my views as a reviewer, I'm probably more susceptible to sort of that than some, having worked in the field a long time and authored the manual. But it's really helpful if you can say, yep, page 4.6, is where it says this is required, and it isn't here. And then this last one is kind of hard because it really comes down to this issue of kind of extending your authority, your role as a reviewer, to go a little bit beyond just saying, oh, passes, doesn't pass, good enough, MPDS compliance, not compliant. Try to get in there and help them out. And I'm careful to word things in such a way not to say this is what you have to do in order to comply, but at the same time to say what you have there is not in compliance. You might consider looking at this particular way of getting to where you want to go. Consider, instead of using pipe to drainage, use surface drainage. Things like, instead of having one facility down at the bottom end, use these landscaped areas that are dispersed throughout the site, and find ways to route runoff to smaller bioretention facilities distributed throughout the site. Or that pervious pavement that is in compliance, if it worked, but you're really going to want to look at that, because the costs are likely to be more than you think they're going to, and by the time you get further along, you're going to try to get out of building. So figuring out how to word that is a bit of an art form, but at the same time, I think you're on pretty solid ground if you stick with that sort of formula that, saying that what is there is not in compliance or won't comply. Here are suggestions on how to get from here to the point of compliance. If there are details, and often there are, I like to see them. Use figures 4.5 and 4.6 in the manual. Those are there. I think a lot of engineers, they know that there's different ways of doing bioretention facilities, and there's been a lot of changes since the first bioswales. They've had different terms, different terminology, different designs. And there is often sort of a persistent, unstated belief that it's okay to kind of mix and match and use, in any one of a number of different criteria. There are very good reasons to use the criteria that are in the manual. We had a lot of years that of experimentation, identified a lot of things that didn't work. Some of those old designs are still hanging around. By the time we got to this, not to say we're entirely done, but I would say that by the time we got to this diagram, 7 to 10 years ago, things had pretty much stabilized. There are very good reasons for things like making things flat, for using precast concrete overflows, not upturned plastic pipes, for making sure that the rim is built flat all the way around. Of course, there's in the South Bay counties, they're required to use the particular soil mix. The Phase 2 permit doesn't specifically require it, but since it's available, we strongly recommend it. And it's a way of avoiding failure of infiltrations for the bioretention soil. All of these things, no filter fabric, all these things are pretty key to making sure that these things are robust and resilient and maintainable. And so trying to make sure that applicants stick to not just the what's shown in the drawing here, but what's shown in the notes as well in terms of the requirements is pretty darn beneficial. Assuming you can get enough of this information in the stormwater control plan, it's really great. If you get it later, then you have to deal with it later. But being able to get the key elevations of the top of soil layer, the top of gravel layer and the bottom of the gravel layer called out in plan view. Basically, that information when you go out in the field, if you do any construction inspection on these, and making sure that those elevations are being controlled during the construction process. And so getting the translation from what's shown on the plans with this to what's being built. That at the key moment when this is excavated and before it's backfilled, that underlying soil is not compacted and preferably, and actually it's pretty much the requirement that they ought to get the hoe in there and tear up that soil a little bit to enhance infiltration. So all of these things, pretty key requirements. There's really no reason not to have most of this information, and particularly the elevations, in the stormwater control plan. But our history is that not to require too much engineering, additional engineering than what might be required anyway, before a project goes for design review or planning commission review. But to the extent that grading and drainage plan, preliminary grading and drainage plan is required, and that's a landscape plan is required, and that you can look and make sure that those line up. It's helpful to get those and review them in the context of the stormwater control plan. Questions on that section? Discussion?
So Dan, there was a
Go
follow-up
ahead.
question on the 50% rule. And that was on the, would the 50% rule apply if you are replacing impervious surfaces, such as if you're taking a parking lot and converting it to housing, for example?
Yes. If you have an acre of parking lot and you are creating or replacing, in this case, you'd be replacing impervious area that exceeded 50%. So you've got an acre of parking lot, and you put 3/4 of an acre of building on it, you are required to then do the remaining parking lot as a retrofit. Does that make sense? Did I get that right?
But if you were replacing less than 50%, then you wouldn't need to, correct?
Right. So if you had an acre parking lot and you've got a 1/4 acre building and the rest is being left there, then you would only be responsible for doing the building. Okay. I hope that answered the question. We can get into it more in the discussion if we need to. Let me get through this section on maintenance, which should have some perspective and information, and then we'll get to the break. If not exactly on time, well, we got 3 minutes, so maybe just a few minutes late. And I'll do a 10-minute break and then shorten up the discussion just a little bit. So I was asked, I think we had some feedback when we were putting together the plans for this session, that folks wanted some information on maintenance for bioretention facilities. And the key thing that I think is essential to get across about bioretention operation and maintenance is that if your design and construction is right, that maintenance is, first place, it's minimal, in terms of basically just requires maintaining the vegetation. And in the second place, even if you don't do it and vegetation kind of looks like heck, you still have a working bioretention facility that's quite effective. The converse is true, is that if you have a problem, particularly certain problems in design and construction, and you go out there and you do your maintenance inspection, you're going to find every time you go out there that it's not functioning properly and that there's not really necessarily a maintenance solution to it. So these 3 pictures sort of give like the beginning and end of that. the first picture on the left, this one is a bioretention facility. It's recently had its vegetation cut back a little bit, looks pretty good. This is a nice, perfectly functional facility, except it was built on a slope. And so when you get a hard rain, and this was taken a few days after one of those rare hard rains that we get, you can see that this facility, that it overflowed here. And that rain was really not hard enough that it should have overflowed. But what happened is, because it slopes this way, it filled up, and all the runoff waiting to pond, it was dry up on this end, and it was deeper than the overflow on this end. And so it took some of the dried vegetated material that was there and spilled over into this. Still functioned okay, but it could have functioned a lot better and treated more runoff if the whole area had been flooded, but it couldn't flood because it sloped this way. So, again, you can go out there and you can say, yeah, the vegetation looks good or it doesn't look good. But the most critical aspect of this facility is that its total effectiveness is somewhat limited by the fact that it's not flat. And the opposite situation is right here. This is some industrial condos that were built. This is one of the first projects where planters and bioretention this was required. And this place went under in the 2008 recession. And here is the bioretention facility, totally still receiving runoff, but totally unmaintained. Point here is that it's still working as a bioretention facility. So it'd be a lot better if it had some living plants in it, but it's still filtering runoff through the soil. It's probably functioning better than this one. And the reason is that it was built entirely correctly in flat from the beginning. And then here is one where the facility was built maybe a little shallow, but it's actually suffered from abuse. Somebody ran over the overflow here and crushed the plastic overflow. And so it's not functioning the way that it should. It could actually use some maintenance and be restored, but it's sort of like in that middle ground where there is some maintenance to do when it really does matter at that point. Then again, if it had been built with one of these instead of this, it would be functioning a lot better despite the lack of maintenance. So that's sort of my spiel on the significance of relative significance of design and construction versus maintenance. And just to follow up on that, each of these criteria that are in figure 4.5 and 4.6, all of those are really about ensuring the robust, resilient operation. And so when you go out there for those O&M inspections, that your facility is going to still be operating correctly because it was built correctly. So all of the criteria that are there are there to ensure long-term operation and maintenance. And really the only one of these that you're likely to be doing much about is the condition of the plants, and then to make sure that none of these things have been altered in some way, that nothing unfortunate has happened to the facility. And then in the stormwater control plan, there are some parameters that are pretty critical. I think that it's important at this stage, even before the operation and maintenance plan is completely written, and they're just submitting to get planning approvals, that these key things are in there, and I think they're in the template and other materials that should be mentioned. And the no's are probably the most key part of this, is that, you know, you have this landscaping that is not going to receive any synthetic fertilizers or pesticides. It's not going to be amended. It needs special attention, that when you get your landscape contractor out there, that they are going to be doing something different and paying a different kind of attention than when they install ordinary landscaping or maybe landscaping on the rest of the site. And then just the key responsibilities that go with the property owner in perpetuity is they got to get out there and, you know, hey, you know, give the facility some love, pull the trash out of it, inspect it, certainly before the rainy season. Take a look at it after a significant storm and see how it's doing, make sure that it didn't suffer any damage. And then maintain the vegetation doing this, but without doing any of this. Really, you know, a well-built, well-operating bioretention facility that doesn't have to look great, but only has to look okay. Really, the vegetation maintenance can come into, you know, removing trash, making sure no invasives are getting in there, and then just doing an annual cutback in January or February. So that's it. We're on to the break, running 5 minutes behind, which is not too bad. Certainly take up any questions that somebody's got anything burning now, or we can reconvene in 10 minutes. We'll go through the compliance for small projects and then discuss the frequently encountered issues that have come up in the chat.
And then in addition, Dan, we're gonna launch another poll during the break. So before people come back, they can take the time to answer a couple of them. It's just kind of ballpark content questions to help just provide a little context. All right, so 10 minutes?
10 minutes.
Dan, you want me to close out the poll? Looks like we have about half the folks participated.
Yeah, I think that's fine. Yeah.
Okay.
I'm just looking at the chat here. I see we've got some questions coming in.
Good. We're getting some good questions, Dan, in the chat. In terms of the content, looks like almost everybody knew, if not from anything else, than the title of today's workshop, that E12 is the section of the permit that deals with new and redevelopment, and that 5,000 square feet is about the size of a basketball court. Olympic-sized swimming pool is about 3 times that, and a football field is over 10 times that. So, just by way of context. And almost everybody recognized that, yes, the city county projects also have to comply with that same requirement.
All right, folks still here? Shall we continue on?
Say, yep.
I love this. Right. Everybody still with me? Let's talk about small projects. Let's see. Yeah, well, I'm getting a forest of thumbs up. Great. Thank you. Man, will I be glad when we can do this in person again. Let's talk about small projects. Actually, how many folks out there, if they could hit that thumbs up button, how many folks would say that the majority of the reviews that they need to do are small projects? Yeah, so a lot. So a small project, the threshold that the water board created, the state water board created, was creates or replaces 2,500 square feet of impervious area or more. That applies to projects between that threshold and the 5,000 square foot threshold, which is a regulated project for anything except a single family home. For single family homes, they can be as big as you want. They're always a small project if they're more than 2,500 square feet, even if they're 10,000 or 20,000 square feet of impervious area under the current requirements. The basic requirement is that they must implement one or more site design measures and quantify the resulting runoff reduction. I will just say, as a matter of history, that this requirement was written originally for the San Francisco Bay Area municipal regional stormwater permit in the South Bay counties, and then was copied into the statewide permit provision E12 the last time that permit was reissued. It has its flaws. And I would say the major flaw, and probably the thing that's the most frustrating, and what we will, I hope, spend some time talking about, is that there's no minimum amount of runoff that's required to be reduced or treated. So hypothetically, you can have a small project, have it come under this requirement, and compliance can be obtained by having 1 square foot of impervious area that is reduced. It drains to a landscaped area. So how do we determine the minimum amount of runoff that we should require? And in this 2019 update, the collective decision was made to add this language to say that the type and extent of runoff reduction measures required for any specific project will be determined by local staff, again, going back to the authority that local staff has, consistent with a maximum extent practicable standard. And there's nothing in the permit that requires anyone to do that, but if we're implementing the permit and we're trying to do what we can for water quality, and we're trying to ensure the best kind of projects in our communities, that's reasonable. And maybe the discussion that we need to have is how do we determine that whether a particular proposal meets that maximum extent practicable standard or not. Does anyone want to chime in their thoughts on this at this point? Their experience with it? I think we probably have a lot of people here who've dealt with this issue at some point or another. All right. Well, let me just throw some ideas out there. I mean, obviously, doing the absolute minimum is not the same as maximum extent practicable. I would say having to always do all impervious area is not, probably doesn't meet a maximum extent practical definition either. My sense is some good guidelines are certainly anything that does not require alterations to the project design. For instance, directing a downspout from a roof onto a lawn instead of onto a paved area that then drains out to the gutter, where, really, in the context of building it, it's the cost difference is insignificant. Obviously, then it should go to the landscaped area. So that's pretty easy, is anything that's no cost. I would say certainly permeable pavers on any kind of walkway is a reasonable way of compliance. Whether it's something that would be required is to say you have to use permeable pavement rather than conventional concrete, say for a sidewalk. I would say that's kind of a push. In most cases, you're going to be able to take that same concrete impermeable sidewalk. It's going to drain off to vegetated areas on the side. And it's going to be, if not as effective, almost as effective as using permeable pavers. If you have a tighter site and there isn't as much opportunity to direct runoff to a vegetated area, my sense is that requiring permeable pavement on driveways is probably typically, well, it's kind of a push. It partly would depend on the situation and the soils, but a lot of these projects, the lots are sloped, and it's not such a great idea to put the pervious pavement on slope surfaces, particularly if it's going to be supporting vehicle loads. So there's some general ideas that I have. I don't know whether that's enough. Do folks, want to make a suggestion about how they determine what maximum extent practicable using this criterion in this particular situation? Thoughts on it?
Well, Dan, from my perspective, I think the permit language being so permissive around either single-family homes or even the small projects lack of quantitation is a frustrating point because it relies on local policy rather than pointing to a statewide permit requirement. So I think that's an internal struggle that I see with all of our permittees. Where do they draw that line? How do they feel confident in standing behind it when there's not a statewide mandate behind it, so to speak?
And yeah, I mean, unfortunately, it gives someone who wants to be difficult ammunition, right?
Exactly.
They can quote the permit at you. Anyone else want to share their experience with this? Anybody else gotten into a tangle situation where they had to go back and forth with someone?
I would say this is mostly for infill projects, right? If this house is part of a larger common plan, it's going to include it in the original design, and it's just being built out.
Well, you can get a single family home in a few different situations, but yeah, perhaps, particularly in some communities, they come up, you get one single family house as an infill a lot more frequently than in outlying areas, it tends to be subdivisions.
Maurice, did you have a question?
How does that affect the implementation?
Maurice, you have your hand up. Why don't you go ahead and unmute and ask?
Yeah. Okay. Sorry. Someone was asking another question. I didn't think it was appropriate, but I guess, yeah. Maurice Armstrong, Marin County Public Works. I haven't had much experience here in California yet. I actually come from a smaller jurisdiction in Western Washington, where the stormwater requirements were much more stringent. And so I've had a lot of experience going back and forth with contractors because at least up there in my jurisdiction, all new impervious or replaced impervious surfaces had to have some sort of treatment, or you had to do some sort of BMP, post-construction BMP. And so from my experience, it was a lot more back and forth with contractors that had no idea what stormwater requirements were. So I guess coming from a different field, I don't know how it's going to be here in California. I'm still really new to the county, but it's really interesting sitting here through this training. So I want to just say thank you.
Maurice, was that so the threshold was really 0 there?
Yeah, so if you were putting in any new surface, you had to do something. And then if you went, it was the minimum, and then you became like a small project, as we would say, at 2,000 square feet, and you had to do more at that point. But it was like, by the minimum, we usually meant like, oh, as long as you put in like some sort of perf pipe, or you're directing all your downspouts and your driveway and things like that towards, vegetated surface, we would accept that. But a lot of it was always a really big struggle trying to educate contractors with the new kind of regulations coming in.
And how did you handle it where you had a situation where, it's an infill site and you've got a driveway and it goes directly out to the curb, and so it's really impractical, or difficult, let's say, to divert that runoff to a vegetated area.
So usually at that point, if it was possible, we would allow them to tie into our stormwater system, depending on where it was. But of course, if it was an infill and like everything was kind of flowing towards the foundation of the home, we couldn't stop them from developing, but we would ask them to do something. We'd ask them to put in a dry well. Even though if they didn't have perfect soils, we needed something to show that if the state ever audited us, that we could be like, hey, we asked them to do something, some sort of BMP. Of course, it's not totally effective, but there's some sort of abatement on this property.
Yeah, so something's better than nothing.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Welcome.
For the applicants who are required to implement this requirement, does this form work pretty well? Is it like too much to do the project data form and do this sketch? Is it, do you get fairly consistent types of submittals? Is there some experience anyone out there would want to share with what they're getting? How is this working?
Either flawlessly or terribly, Dan, because nobody's raising their hand.
Yeah. Right. Yes. All right. Okay. Well, let's move on then to our frequently encountered issues. I took these off of the chat while we were in the break. And actually, I wanted to straighten this out because I think I probably misstated the 50% rule, so I wanted to jump on that first. This is what it says, actually, just in table 1.1, in a footnote to it, and I'm almost positive this is quoted directly from provision E.12. Where a project results in an increase of more than 50% of the impervious area of a previously existing development, that's when it applies. Runoff from new, replaced, or previously existing impervious surfaces must be included in its got this proviso in there that in the permit that says to the extent feasible. So that is a great out for situations where it's very difficult to do so. But the main thing that I wanted to clarify there is that this comes from a comparison of the pre-project condition to the post-project condition, and a simple comparison of whether the impervious area is increased by 50% or more.
So Dan, to clarify, in the example you gave while you were giving it, if a site, if there was a 1 acre site that was being redeveloped and it was only 50% impervious at this point, and they were replacing all 50% of the impervious, but not doing any more than that, then it would not trigger the rule. Is that correct?
It would, well, and yes, it would not trigger the rule on the North Bay. It would trigger the rule in the South Bay, but we're in the North Bay.
Okay.
Yeah, is that yes, it would. It's actually an increase of the previously existing development. So I think the only fair way to interpret that is that you actually do a toting up of the impervious area in the existing condition. You do a toting up of the impervious area in the built condition once the project is completed, and you compare those two numbers to see whether there's an increase of more than 50% of the existing impervious area. Next question, coordinating stormwater control with planning approvals. There was this question of when is the best time to do it? And if I can get anybody to respond here, the question that I have with this is, the intent of the manual is that the stormwater control plan is prepared as part of the application for planning approvals, along typically with the submittal of a site plan, sometimes a grading and drainage plan, preliminary landscape plan, but that it is included at the time before conditions of approval are made final, and before it is part of what goes to a review body. Is anyone doing it differently? Or does anyone want to describe their process as being different from that? Okay. And then there was
Dan, I was just going to say that I think there are situations, I think that's what you described with the planning approvals is the way it normally works. But sometimes things come in, like especially with the infill projects that were meant, or a redevelopment project on a single lot. Those might not have like the full planning approvals. They might just be coming in for something like a building permit. And I think those become challenging, especially because the building officials don't always know all of this stuff,
right,
and don't want to talk to us. My apologies to any building officials on the call.
Yeah, I can see how that would be a problem. Yes, and it's why when we've negotiated with water boards, we've tried to get them not to push us into a situation where we were having to enforce stormwater requirements just to issue a building approval without any discretionary review. But where that happens, yes, I can see that would be difficult. Anyone want to share their experience at the building permit counter having to deal with doing a stormwater control plan for a small project? We had the question, are public projects covered by E12? The answer to that, I believe, is yes, right?
Yes.
But yeah, they're covered. So
Absolutely.
if you are doing the, if you have a public project and it is, creating or replacing impervious area above the respective thresholds, then all the requirements should be followed through. Often I think that is difficult because often a public works project will not necessarily go through the same discretionary review process. And so a separate, a process needs to be, invented or created to make sure that happens. Question, what to do when the submittal is incomplete? I tried to kind of cover that in the, what to look for first is really to try to figure out, hey, if it's incomplete, and it has one of those fatal flaws of particularly not having the drainage management areas delineated, then I think it's the most efficient thing to do and fair to everybody is to send an email and say it doesn't meet this basic requirement. Refer to the manual and ask that it be resubmitted, and then very carefully word something to the effect of noting that that a complete and detailed review will be done at the time that a resubmittal, to make it clear that you're not passing on everything else by saying that piece is missing. On road rehabilitation projects, as it is, the phase 2 permit pretty much exempts anything done to existing pavement within the right of way. But we are facing changes to that down in the South Bay. I don't know when it might make its way up here. But the changes that are in the revised tentative order scheduled to be adopted in May do apply the regulated project requirements to contiguous roadway of an acre or more if it is removed down to the top of the base course. There are some issues with exactly how to define that. And there is the contiguous proviso, but that's where it's at now. Is there a follow-up on that? I saw it in the chat. I'm not sure that that's exactly what was being got at, but.
The roadway projects would be, as long as they currently maintain original line and grade, correct? If they widen the road or change the design at all, it would then be required. But if they follow the original line and grade, it would be routine maintenance.
That's the criterion that's typically used, yes. Yeah, so that even if you're doing like a major roadway rehabilitation, if it's in the same right of way and it's not being changed in terms of the grading, that it would, no treatment would be required. I think in the past quite a few years in the North Bay counties, I think there's only been a few cases of new roads being built that triggered the regulated project threshold.
Dan, there's a proposed change in the construction general permit regarding roads that talks about a road project that goes down to the erodible subgrade. So not one of the structural elements of the road, the top, the base, the et cetera, would not be considered routine maintenance anymore if it disturbs an acre or more. So I'm kind of curious if you think that change in the CGP relative to construction activities versus maintenance activities for roads would change how we need to think about E12 compliance.
So
I
it
had
says,
to ask you the hard question.
yeah, that was kind of, so it says erodible subgrade, it's an acre or more.
Right.
And what particular requirement does it trigger?
It's going to trigger, basically it's saying that if you do that, if you're an acre or more and you go down to the, you are exposing, if you are exposing an acre or more of erodible subgrade, so basically taking it down to the dirt, it would no longer, so you could be maintaining the original line and grade of a project and completely ripping out the road and just rebuilding it from the soil up. That would be no longer be considered routine maintenance. It would be subject to the construction general permit. So you'd have to get a CGP. So I'm just curious if that, would we have considered such a project before routine maintenance relative to E12? And should we rethink how we approach that in the future?
Well, I'll be very interested to see how frequently one runs across a project that triggers that requirement. Whether that's like a typical way, a type of project to remove the base course all the way down to the erodible.
Yeah, I think full depth reclamation projects are questionable. And this may get to Sonia's question earlier on that she asked. I think it becomes a question with the full depth reclamations if we're exposing erodible subgrade or not.
Well, wouldn't this also count for parking lots?
Parking lots are a similar but somewhat different animal. And there it really does get into this question of whether it is replaced impervious surface or maintained impervious surface. And I think that it's vague enough in the phase 2 permit as it's written now that municipalities have a fair amount of ability to go either way. And so, I have seen because municipalities wanted to get more treatment out there that they have required LID on extensive parking lot reconstruction. But I have also seen cases where there was pretty significant work done where it was not required.
Sandy, I think the new modifications they're proposing for the construction permit would apply to those parking lots, maybe more so than roads.
I kind of agree with you, Jason, but I know that when we suggested incorporating that with the roads, the permittees wanted no part of that. They wanted them to be kept separate and distinct and not necessarily commingle the two thoughts. But I, like Dan said, they're similar but different needs.
In Marin, we typically go with if they're doing the grind and just overlay, then it doesn't trigger it. But if they go over 5,000 square feet with a remove and replace, then it will trigger it.
Yeah, and Sonia, I think you're still on the call. If you are, you had an interesting project in Napa, didn't you, where you got into, I think it was your project that we got into a debate with the QSD who insisted that it was a regulated project.
Yes, that is what happened. And ultimately, we set it aside and it was determined that this is like the last time that we're going to be able to consider a maintenance project from an FDR, but FDR happens a lot in the road maintenance world. Roadways degrade over time and then they essentially need to just be totally rebuilt from the base up. But it's not an expanded envelope. It's not a changed grade. And during construction, it looks a lot like a whole bunch of dirt. So, it looks like exposed road Um, although it's typically self-contained and yeah, anyway. We
Sonia, was that
survived this one.
I was going to ask Sonia, was that a public road project or a private road project?
It's a public road project, and this happens a lot. This project was in Napa County. It's Airport Boulevard between State Route 29 and the airport. It's about a mile worth of 4 lanes and turn pockets, and it's heavily used by truck traffic. There's a light, in the roadway and plenty of utilities. And essentially, we just determined that the only way to handle all of that traffic impact was to rebuild it. It hadn't been resurfaced in quite a while, maybe actually 20 years, but which is, sort of typically our design life on a roadway improvement project. And a lot of times we can get away with putting an overlay on top of an existing road and, therefore not digging anything and not showing anybody any dirt. But sometimes we can't, especially in a road that is, one, has, had deferred maintenance, or 2, has really heavy traffic impacts the way Airport Boulevard does.
Thank you for that. It's I think that it is now is that we are still safe to exclude. Although, are you saying what was that water board staff or someone who was saying that this was not going to be allowed in the future, or on that on the Airport Boulevard project, or was that just? Sandy,
can you remind me? I think it was between you, me, and Jameson that we sort of went a couple rounds on this.
Yeah, it was a bit of an intersection of the kind of the construction and the post-construction requirements, Dan, so maybe a little tangential. The project had planned to do post-construct, had planned to incorporate low impact development. So that was a good thing. But we had firmly believed at the county level that this was not going to trigger the construction requirements of the state's construction requirements. And the QSD actually put their foot down and said, this is clearly a construction project.
Uh-huh.
So in that case, we had an over-aggressive QSD.
Right, but that was on the construction.
Yeah. Fortunately, the county had already planned to do the LID features. I think there had been some separate money that was made available for that. So that was like, we had the leg up there.
No, sorry, opposite. We had planned to do the construction stormwater plan and then took it out at the last minute when we bid the project, or tried to take it out when we were in the middle of the project. The QSD put her foot down, and then the LIDs we determined were not necessary in that case. Yeah.
Sorry.
Yeah, no, thank you. You're refreshing me.
Yeah. It's been a while. It was a convoluted project with a lot of moving parts,
yes.
But I think that's pretty typical of these county and municipal projects where you're making decisions on available information as you're moving through the design process, and then suddenly your assumptions get upturned.
Yeah. Yeah, this language right here that I have up, where it says does not include trenching, excavation, and resurfacing associated with linear projects, pavement grinding and resurfacing of existing roadways, which would seem to cover pretty much, or routine replacement of damaged pavement such as pothole repair or replacement of short non-contiguous sections of roadway, which then raises the question about what's meant about replacement of long contiguous sections of roadway. But it's it's vague enough that it doesn't seem to have the teeth that would bring in almost any kind of road project necessarily, unless it was, actually a new project.
With a note that these being public road projects as opposed to parking lots, which
Right, yeah.
are not covered under this caveat.
And then under parking lots, I think you're left with that question about whether it is pavement resurfacing within the existing footprint, or whether it's replacement. So it's subject to interpretation. How are we doing on time? Do we still have, a few more minutes?
There's a couple of additional comments or questions in the chat, Dan. I don't know if you've seen them about semi-rural areas and roadways for emergency egress. Or you can, but yeah, you got them.
Do I? Does somebody want to get on and clarify either of those?
Erica, you want to unmute and ask your question about the CAL FIRE?
Hi, Dan. It's really nice to meet you.
Hi.
Hi. I'm really just conflating two fields that are really kind of intertwined in my background here, which is fire recovery. Forgive me. I think my audio is right here. So essentially, there seems to be a lot of habitat areas that are getting cut through with roadways, which to me seems like a potential for erosion and degradation, especially for transport of like pollutants like soil particles, essentially sediment transport. And so I was curious if you may be experiencing this in the South Bay, like near Pacifica or towns like that are experiencing they're calling for routes of egress through like Golden Gate National Recreation Area down there. And then up here, we're just seeing it a lot because there's typically only one way in and one way out, which is leading to a lot of fear around egress during emergencies such as fire. So I'm curious if these areas, I know these areas are fairly rural and may not be within a phase 2 permit area, but I'm curious if the day is coming when we start to think about these areas and sediment transport. Thanks.
Yeah, are most of these roads or all these roads unpaved?
I think in that case, they would be unpaved or they'd be gravel. Yeah.
Yeah. There was effort some years ago to try to require practices for maintenance and I think construction as well of rural roads, and to cover that in NPDES permits. And I wasn't directly involved because it was a rural, it was applied to only a couple of permittees. And maybe Sandy, I don't know if you remember this, but my understanding is that it was sort of moved into a box of, basically an agreement to follow specific guidance on construction of those kinds of rural roads and, ways of doing drainage for them. And it was taken out of the NPDES context. That's my memory.
I'll add to that, Dan and Sandy jump in, but in Marin, those types of requirements find their way into the sediment TMDL implementation actions. So typically that's where we see those things creep into our permit, is through So the unpaved roads requirements sneak in like the, sediment TMDLs.
Uh-huh. And so far, have you been able to keep them limited to basically following the guidance?
Yeah, actually, for the most part, we've been able to sort of push those requirements onto those folks that manage those unpaved roads. So for us, Parks and Open Space, and they'll have something like a roads and trail management plan where they'll integrate those requirements into what they say they're going to do for those pieces.
Yeah, there's an interesting kind of split in the regulatory realm. Rural, a lot of times we think of rural roads as being unpaved roads, and that's like the guidance, the Fish for Seed Network guidance on designing basically forestry roads. And I think that's a lot of what Erica is mentioning, where you're not necessarily paving it, you might gravel it. But there is also a lot of times within the NPDS context, the rural roads gets more interpreted as those out of the way roads that, they might be paved, but they are, and typically these only affect counties. So it's usually like the hinterlands of Marin County, the hinterlands of Napa County, where you have these these roads that they're paved, they're not dirt, but they have pipes that just, how the storm drainage is handled from those roads becomes the question. And, the old T culverts are not necessarily smiled upon anymore.
Yeah. Okay. Let me just cover these things fairly quickly, and then I think we're coming up on our time, and we should do our wrap up. On the 4% sizing factor, there was a question in the chat about the adequacy or how that related in some way to controlling flow peaks. In the just wanted to cover that. Going back to when the sizing requirements for treatment facilities were first explored, that the idea is you want to capture the runoff which is generated by small storms, which is most runoff. And the idea is that if you get to capturing 80% of the total volume generated over a long period of time, that you're doing pretty well. There are various different ways of measuring that. One is just the 85th percentile storm intensity. The one that the 4% sizing factor is based on is the idea that if you capture rainfall up to 0.2 inches per hour, that you're going to get close right around that 80% of total runoff. And that 0.2 inches per hour is just conservatively, and I think there's a figure in the post-construction manual that illustrates this, is that 0.2 inches per hour is considered, well, if you then take that intensity of rainfall and you conservatively assume that all the runoff reaches a bioretention facility, which is designed to infiltrate at 5 inches per hour, which is the design criterion for those, that 0.2 divided by 5 ends up with 0.04 or 4%. And then so that was the basis for coming up with the sizing factor. It's a little rough. It's worked out mostly because it's doable. And for almost all types of development, and it's but important thing to remember is just that it's not designed by itself to control the really big storms. It's designed to control small storms. About compost and nitrogen, I think the easy, if somewhat glib answer to that is that nitrogen is not at this point a concern in the Bay. And so we haven't heard like a lot of issues about, although it's certainly come up before, about the idea that having a mix of compost and sand means that you're basically adding nitrogen into the stormwater. The data on that, sort of the missing pieces of it are, first of all, we don't really have that good data on what proportion of the discharge from bioretention facilities is infiltrated into the underlying groundwater versus being discharged through an under drain. So we don't really have a good handle, a totally good handle on that number. And we also don't have a good number on the amount of nitrogen that is discharged from these facilities after they've been operating, say, for 1, 2, or 5 years. And so once we had that, we'd have a better answer for that question and how much of a concern it is. But at this point, I would say the reason that it hasn't been dug into that deeply is because the bay isn't nitrogen limited. Question is, decomposed granite impervious or pervious? Really good question. The call on this is typically if a pervious pavement meets the criteria that are in the manual, it is pervious, and if it doesn't meet the criteria, it's considered impervious, which is kind of a black and white way of making the call, and that can apply to decomposed granite in terms of its depth. I would say the confounding factor or added complexity with DG is that a lot of the time it's a binder is added to it. I would say if a binder is added to it, it pretty much needs to be considered impervious and the runoff from it handled by dispersing it to adjacent landscaping or something. But it could be considered a pervious pavement if it were designed according to the criteria. And then the last question, what about phase projects? I think the guidance there is that really you want a stormwater control plan which reflects the level of detail and level of development of the proposal which is being reviewed. So if you have a phase development and it's coming in, as describing sort of a very general layout, then you want a very general or equivalently general idea of how runoff is going to be moved from impervious surfaces to dispersal or to bioretention facilities. And then if there's, a part of it that is going to be built now and is being developed and you've got lot lines and house footprints and roads and everything like that, then you want a concomitant level of detail in a stormwater control plan that basically, goes right up to the level that's required in the manual. But if you had other areas where it's a little more vague about what's going to happen in future phases, then it might be appropriate to have a little bit less detail for those parts. So it's really a little bit of a judgment call, but I think the idea is that you don't want that. You're not going to be able to have the requirements of the stormwater control plan sort of drive the level of detail for the rest of the project proposal. But when you do have a certain level of detail included in that, the stormwater control plan ought to be moving right along with it. Okay.
Dan, there's a follow-up question on that. And can you phase a project to stay under the 5,000 foot square limits and avoid complying with the post-construction requirements?
And the answer to that, I think it is and should be no. Is if you're deliberately piecemealing, I think the same criterion as one would apply when reviewing something for CEQA applies, which is you're looking at the whole of an action, the whole of a project, that municipality is being asked to make a call on. And so if a municipality is, being, is going ahead and there's a, plan of development, or obviously a future plan to do something, then it ought to be included. And I think it's certainly better to sort of take the more assertive end of that, because compliance is not necessarily that big a deal, right? So the extent that people will go to try to avoid complying with the requirements, when often all they had to do was just figure out how to disperse something in landscaping, is sometimes extraordinary.
And then similarly, what criteria do you look for on large common developments that may take years to build out? Do the original requirements cover them for the duration of the project, or do they need to revisit when regulations update in the middle of the project?
I think that really gets into the level of approval that was given for the project in the first place. And so I think the key question there is, are you coming back for a discretionary approval? And if you're coming back for a discretionary approval, then you may very well be subject to whatever requirements are in effect at the time that action is taken. But if you have your planning approval for the whole project, then you may legitimately be grandfathered. I think the requirements in the MRP are a little bit more specific as to this, and it's probably come up a little bit more. And that's more or less the way the grandfathering provisions work.
But for the phase 2, pretty much if you have approved a master plan and they're following the master plan and not needing to come back, 5 years later for some big change that's going to require discretionary review, then they would continue to follow the requirements that they started with, as opposed to anything new that comes along midway.
Yeah. The flip side of that, which I haven't seen happen so much with stormwater, is I've seen some developments that had like an old design that nobody really wanted anymore, including the developer. But they got built that way just so they didn't have to go back through public process. We certainly don't want to create that situation, but we hope we aren't. Okay, well, it's 3:30, a little after. I would just ask one more question, and that is if anybody wants to pipe up and say, here's something we really ought to make sure is covered in part 2, do so now.
And a reminder to folks, part 2 is the training that not only includes you all, but the public development, or the sort of the private development community, those folks that are doing the design work for public and private projects.
And it's focused on planning, design, and construction. Actually, the design and building aspect of LID.
So feel free to speak up now, unmute yourself and just speak up, or you can put those comments into the chat as well.
Or you can email them to us.
Or you can email to us. And then we'll give a couple more seconds for this, and then I will also launch a poll, which is just an evaluation of this training, and the last question in it is a prompt for this same thing, which is, what else do you want to know about? So Dan, I'll just opine, basically all of those things that we talked about being frequently experienced problems and issues in the design and construction. I'd love to cover those with folks in the room that are responsible for that design and construction.
Okay.
I would add, since the public's going to be there, addressing whether or not they can get a waiver for their project. That seems to come up more frequently than not.
And I think the answer to that is fairly obvious and straightforward. It's like there is no such thing. I don't think I've ever heard of anyone saying, "Oh no, you don't have to comply."
I agree. It's not always easy for them to understand, though.
Erica has some good points in the chat that we'll make sure that we include. Thank you.
All right, Dan, I'm going to go ahead and launch the poll, but please, anybody that wants to either speak up or add some notes to the chat or what else could be included, please do so. But also please complete the poll and let us know how we did, what else you'd like to hear about, and that sort of thing. So thanks, Dan.
Thank you, Rob.
Thank you, guys.
Thanks everyone for attending today.
Thanks all.
Thanks, everybody.
All right, I just ended the poll and we'll put it up just so it's part of the record. And I guess we'll settle on a date for the training number 2 and get out a save the date to everybody. And anyway, thanks, Dan. I appreciate all your help.
Thank you, Rob. Great working with all of you.
Yeah, the in person, I'm sure we'll get a lot more discussion, but format's tough. But
Nothing like being able to look somebody in the eye and get them like that. Come on.